or the Georgian poets. Georgian poetry was the poetry which flourished during the period of the King George V. His period of reign was, his period of administration was between 1910 and 1936. This period came to be known as Georgian poetry. This period is called Georgian poetry in English literature. So we are going to study about some Georgian poets and the specialities or the features of the Georgian poetry. You know, the Georgian poets reacted against the decadent transitional poetry. Decadent transitional poetry was something we studied in our earlier classes. It was decadent poetry. You know, the decadence or the decadent poets defied the conventions of the Victorian period. They scandalized the period by indulging in drink and drug. They were the poets who rolled in euphoria or comfort. So, these poets, the Georgian poets, reacted against the decadent transitional poetry. By 1912, Rupert Brooke, he was a war poet. We are doing war poets separately. By 1912, Rupert Brooke was fully satisfied with the prevailing or existing opinion that the public neglect of the public towards poetry, the public neglect towards the poetry was a great hindrance. It was a great stumbling block. It was a great block in the development of modern poetry. Rupert Brooke sided with this statement. By 1912, Rupert Brooke was fully satisfied with the existing opinion or prevailing opinion that public neglect was a great hindrance in the development of modern poetry. He planned to write a volume of poems. You know, Rupert Brooke, he planned to write a volume of poems and to publish it as the work of 12 different writers. He sought the help of 12 different writers or poets, and he planned to publish the anthology or the collection of poems as the work of 12 different writers. Then Marsh, M-A-R-S-H, Edward Marsh, one of the Georgian poets, Edward Marsh suggested, he put forward a suggestion. What was his suggestion? Marsh suggested to publish an anthology by flesh and blood poets, common poets, ordinary poets, or the poets who belonged to the society in which they are living. They are called flesh and blood poets. What was the suggestion put forward by Robert Marsh? Marsh suggested to publish an anthology. Anthology means collection. Anthology by flesh and blood poets. And in September 1912, in the month of September, and the year is 1912, this suggestion was accepted. The suggestion put forward by Marsh was accepted by a number of poets, a group of poets. It was accepted by some outstanding poets of the period. So the suggestion put forward by Marsh that to publish an anthology by flesh and blood poets, it was accepted in September 1912 by some outstanding poets. Who were the outstanding poets who sided with Robert Marsh? Who are the most important poets who accepted the suggestion put forward by Robert Marsh? One is Edmund Blundell, and Rupert Brooke, Robert Graves, D.H. Lawrence, the novelist and poet D.H. Lawrence, Walter de la Mare, Siegfried Sassoon, Siegfried Siegfried Sassoon. Siegfried Sassoon. John drink water. Harold Munro and Edward Marsh. Edward Marsh was the poet who put forward this. He was a publisher also. He was the man who put forward the suggestion of publishing in the form of an anthology of poems by the flesh and blood poets. So, who are the outstanding poets who cited the opinion or suggestion put forward by Edward Marsh, Edmund Blunden, Rupert Brooke, Robert Graves, D.H. Lawrence, Walter de la Mare, Siegfried Sassoon, John Drinkwater, Harold Munro, and Edward Marsh. The publication of this volume, the publication of this anthology or collection of poems was titled Georgian Poetry. The publication of the poems or the publication of this volume was entitled Georgian Poetry, and it was published during the years 1911 and 1912. So it had the desired effect on the public. The publication of the anthology, the collection of the poems had the desired effect. It had the required or desired effect on the public, who began to buy and read poetry profusely. The public really accepted the publication of the anthology. The public began to purchase, buy the anthology, collection of poems, and read profusely. They actually sided with the publication of the anthology. They were full support, public were full support to the Georgian poetry, which was entitled by the same title. So, the publication of this volume, what was the title of the volume? Georgian Poetry. During which years it was published? 1911, 1912. Had the desired effect on the public, who began to buy and read poetry. 5 volumes of poetry appeared between 1912 and 19. Yes, as I told you earlier, Georgian poetry flourished in the reign of George V. By 1922, the fervor of 1912, the spirit of 1912, the Georgian spirit of 1912 had died down. By the year 1922, the fervor, the ardent fervor or spirit of 1912 Georgian poetry had died down, and died down in most of the poets. And the reign of Georgian was almost over. The reign administrative period of Georgian was almost over. The Georgians aimed at putting English poetry on a new strength and beauty. The Georgians aimed at putting or giving English poetry a new strength and beauty. The Georgians aimed at putting English poetry on a new strength and beauty. The Georgians, of course, had a positive aim. The Georgian poets, of course, had a positive aim in writing poetry. What was the positive aim? It was to treat natural things in a clear, natural and beautiful way. Their aim was to treat natural things in a clear, natural and beautiful way. They discarded all formally religious and philosophic themes. They discarded means abandoned. They threw away all formally religious and philosophic themes. They avoided or neglected the philosophic themes as well as religious themes in their poetry. Then what did they do? They endeavored, they tried, they took earnest efforts to restore simplicity and naturalness. You know, the Georgian poets tried their maximum. They endeavored to restore simplicity and naturalness to English poetry and avoided the use of archaic diction. Diction means the system of using words. They avoided the use of archaic means very old words which are no longer in use. That is archaic diction, the words which are no longer in present use or current use. They avoided using archaic diction such as thee. Instead of the plural you, in archaic form it is thee, or thou, the singular you. They avoided using the archaic terms, archaic dictions such as thee or thou, and grandiloquent expressions. Grandiloquent expressions means the pompous and extravagant expressions of language, use of jargons, or the use of ununderstandable diction, the use of pompous and extravagant words, that is grandiloquent expressions, and all the pomposities of thought and expression. They also avoided using all the pomposities of thought and expression. They never used the grand thoughts and expressions in their poetry. So what they do? They endeavored to restore simplicity and naturalness to English poetry and avoided the use of archaic dictions such as thee or thou, grandiloquent expressions, and all the pomposities, grand expressions of thought and expression. They composed neat and melodious poems. The Georgian poets composed or wrote very neat and melodious poems, musical poems. They composed, what kinds of poems did they compose? They composed neat and melodious poems. The Georgian poetry is escapist in the sense that it does not show any awareness of the industrial world around it. It was a period of industrial revolution. We know because of the advancement in science and technology and mechanization, industrial revolution was its great height. But the Georgian poetry is escapist. We can call it an escapist poetry in the sense that it does not show any awareness. It does not exhibit any consciousness. It does not exhibit any knowledge of the industrial world around it. So these are the features of the Georgian poetry. Now let us pass on to some major poets, major Georgian poets. At first let us take into account Walter de la Mare, WALTER-DELAMARE. His period was between 1873 and 1956. 1873 and 1956. Walter de la Mare. His place is very high as a Georgian poet. As a Georgian poet, his place, his position is very high. He is essentially a poet of children. He was a children's poet. He was essentially a poet for. As far as Walter de la Mare is concerned, the burning problems of the modern life did not inspire him. The burning problems around him did not inspire Walter de la Mare. He preferred from the beginning to concentrate on romance and nature as his main themes. He liked from the beginning, he preferred from the beginning to concentrate on romance and nature as his main themes, stories and nature, as his romantic stories and nature as his main themes. He is basically a poet of fairyland. He can be described as a poet of fairyland. Fairyland, you know, the stories that appear in grandma stories. Fairylands are usually the themes in grandma stories. Fairyland. He is basically or fundamentally a poet of fairyland, creating in his poetry a world of dreams, fantasies, and imagination. You know, he is basically a poet, Walter de la Mare. He is basically a poet of fairyland, creating in his poetry a world of dreams. His was a world of dreams, or he created through the poems a world of dreams, fantasies, unreal things, unbelievable things, and imagination. His stories are full of imaginations. That is a world which appeals to children as well as grown-up people. It is a world which appeals to children and grown-up people alike. His published works are, Walter de la Mare's published works are The Listeners and Other Poems. The Listeners and Other Poems published in the year 1912. Peacock Pie, published in the year 1913. Peacock Pie, published in the year 1913. The Fleeting and Other Poems, published in the year 1933. The Fleeting and Other Poems. Bells and Grass, published in the year 1941. Then Collected Poems, published in 1942. The Burning Glass and Other Poems, published in 1945. The Traveller, published in the year 1946. So he is deemed or branded or reckoned or considered as a poet of childhood. As a poet of childhood, Walter de la Mare is really unsurpassable. Nobody could surpass his poetic imagination, fantasies as a poet of childhood. As a poet of childhood, Walter de la Mare is quite unsurpassable. Nobody could outshine him. Nobody could surpass him as a poet of childhood. He has very successfully captured the joys and pleasures of childhood in his songs of childhood. In his collection of poems, Songs of Childhood, he has very successfully captured. He has very successfully used the joys and pleasures of childhood. In which collection? Songs of Childhood. No other poet has described the state of childhood with such vividness and insight. No other poet in whole of English literature has created the state of childhood with such vividness and insight. No other poet has described the state of childhood with such vividness, clarity, and insight as he has done, as Walter de la Mare has done. His poetry of childhood exhibits an outstanding variety. Actually, his poetry of childhood exhibits or shows an outstanding, surprising, wonderful variety. We can actually discern or see wonderful variety in his poetry of childhood. His poetry of childhood exhibits an astounding variety. That means it includes, the poetry of childhood includes remarkable psychological insight in dealing with childhood. He expresses or exhibits remarkable or considerable or great psychological insight in dealing with the childhood. He knows the psychology of children and he shows remarkable psychological insight in dealing with the childhood. Another distinguishing feature of his poetry is the note of fantasy. Another characteristic feature or distinguishing feature of his poetry is the note of the element of fantasy. What is fantasy? It is the faculty of imagining impossible and improbable things. It is the ability, fantasy means the faculty or ability of imagining impossible or improbable things. That is, so another distinguishing feature of his poetry is the note of fantasy. Fantasy, note of fantasy. It means, fantasy means the faculty of imagining impossible or improbable things. Then as I told you just earlier, as I have just told you, he is a creator of fairyland. He is actually a creator of fairyland. Fairies, ghosts, 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 and phantoms, these unearthly beings, these unearthly creatures, fairies, ghosts, and phantoms haunt his poems. H-A-U-N-D, haunt means visit his poems. There are fairies, ghosts, and phantoms in his poems. Like Coleridge, like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the romantic poet, he deftly mingles natural and supernatural together. Like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, he deftly, very cleverly mixes natural and supernatural together. So we have seen that, we have studied that Coleridge was able to present supernatural things in a natural way. He has mixed up natural elements in supernatural aspects, supernatural themes. He was able to make supernatural things appear as quite natural. That was the speciality of Coleridge, just opposite of William Wordsworth. In Lyrical Ballads, which was published in 1798 by Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth, Coleridge had contributed only 4 poems, and they are supernatural poems, but they appear to have a naturalness about them. That is a speciality of the poems of Coleridge. So, like Coleridge, Walter de la Mare also deftly mingles natural and supernatural together. Walter de la Mare was a great lyric poet. He was a lyric poet, musical poet. What is a lyric? Lyric is a musical poem, highly emotional. A musical poem, highly emotional. Walter de la Mare was a great lyric poet. His lyrics have sweetness, harmonious melody, harmonious music, and a note of wistful melancholy, and a note of melancholy, a touch of melancholy. Melancholy means sadness. Melancholy, which is the natural outcome. Melancholy is the natural result of the transience. Transience means the temporary aspect. Transience, the momentary aspect or temporary aspect, not permanent thing. That is what is transience of beauty, love, and life. We know that beauty, love, and life are not everlasting. They are not so permanent. They are perishable. Beauty, love, and life are perishable. So, out of this transient nature, out of the temporary nature of beauty, love, and life, see, there is a touch of melancholy, there is a touch of sadness in his poetry. So, or we can say his lyrics have sweetness, harmonious melody, a note of wistful melancholy, which is the natural result or outcome of the transience or the temporary nature of beauty, love and life. Then the second poet, W.H. Davies. W.H. Davies, D-A-V-I-E-S, Davies. His period was between 1879 and 1940. 1879 and 1940. Davies writes in his autobiography, he has written an autobiography, and he writes in his autobiography, the autobiography is entitled The Autobiography of a Super Tramp. He has lived as a tramp for some time in his life. His autobiography is entitled The Autobiography of a Super Tramp, which was published in 1908. 1908. And in the autobiography of a super tramp, he writes that it was after losing his right foot. It was after losing his right foot while from a railway train in Canada that he turned to poetry. In his autobiography, he refers to the circumstances he started poetry. He describes that it was after losing his right foot from a railway train in Canada that he turned his attention to poetry. He turned to poetry. His poems are contained in the collections The Soul's Destroyer and Other Poems. The Soul's Destroyer and Other Poems, which was published in 1905. And New Poems, another collection, New Poems, which was published in 1907. 1907. Then collected poems. Collected poems published in the year 1916 and another volume published in the year 1928 and 1934. Thrice the collection of poems was published. They were different poems. The different poems were grouped together and published in all these years. Then love poems. Another collection of poems, love poems, which was published in 1935. He wrote beautiful lyrics on love and nature. He wrote poems on love and nature. He composed very beautiful poems on love and nature. He was almost like William Wordsworth in his worship of nature. Davies was a poet of many moods. He was a poet of many moods, but he never lost sight of nature. He was a worshipper of nature. He was against urbanization and all. He was a real admirer of nature. He never lost sight of nature. And pastoral life. He also loved and wrote about pastoral life, rustic life, pastoral life. The sights and sounds of nature and the simple lives of the country folk. The sights, beautiful melodious sights, sounds and sights of the beautiful sights and melodious sounds of nature, and the simple lives of the rustic folk, village people, appeal to his imagination and poetic sensibilities. The sights and sounds of nature and the simple lives of the rustic or the village people appeal to his imagination and poetic sensibilities. He flew to nature for, he himself writes, he flew to nature, he approached nature, he ran to nature for solace, comfort, mental comfort, and forgetfulness, for forgetting painful things, pursuing joy, following or running after joy, and eschewing. Eschewing means abstaining from or avoiding sadness. It was, of course, a Wordsworthian concept. He also believed in the Wordsworthian concept of the healing power of nature. He flew to nature for solace, forgetfulness, pursuing joy, and eschewing or avoiding or neglecting, abstaining from sadness. Then Davies had a companionship with nature. He had a deep friendship with nature. W.H. Davies was a lyric poet. His short lyrics are remarkable for easy and spontaneous expression. His short and lyrics are highly remarkable, are very remarkable for easy and spontaneous expression. The expressions come spontaneously. His poem Leisure begins with the famous line, "What is this life if full of care? We have no time to stand and stare." So these lines show the necessity of man becoming in tune with nature, man enjoying the beauties of nature. If he is led away from nature, he will suffer from mental problems. The best remedy for his physical and mental problem is turning to nature. If man is leading a mechanical life, ignoring the nature, it will be a boring life. Life will become a boring affair, he says. Then another poet, John Masefield, John Masefield. John Masefield. His period was between 1878 and 1962. Masefield was the central figure of the Georgian poetry. We can say that Masefield was the central figure of the Georgian poetry. He became the poet laureate. Of England after Bridges, after the term of Bridges, or after the death of Bridges. After the death of Bridges, he became the poet laureate in 1930. W.H. Davies was, of course, a man of great genius. He was a versatile genius. John Masefield was a versatile writer. He was a poet, dramatist, novelist and essayist. He was many things. He emerged as a prominent poet. He came out as a prominent poet with the publication of the Saltwater Ballads in 1902. The publication of the Saltwater Ballads was in the year 1902, and it made him a prominent poet. The publication of the Saltwater Ballads in 1902 made him a prominent poet. Then his poems reveal the poet's own experiences of sea life. The poems, especially in Saltwater Ballads, reveal the poet's own experiences of his sea life. Then ballads and poems marked a remarkable advance in the development of his poetic art. His collection of poems, ballads and poems, marked or showed a remarkable advance in his development as a great poet, or in the development of his poetic art. Masefield infused fresh vigor and vitality into English narrative poetry. John Masefield infused, or he gave fresh vigor, fresh energy and vitality, life into English narrative poetry. He imparted to English poetry. Imparted means gave. He gave to English poetry realism. He brought out in English poetry realism, or the aspects of realism. The Everlasting Mercy, a collection of poems, The Everlasting Mercy. Everlasting Mercy, it was published in 1911 and is styled as the Confession of a Man. The poem is styled as a confession of a man who turned from sin to Christianity. The Widow in the By Street, another poem. The Widow in the By Street, Bye. by street. It tells the tragic tale of a widow, Gundry, whose son Jimmy is hanged for murder. It is the sad tale, sad story of a widow Gundry, whose son Jimmy is hanged for the crime of murder. Then Dauber, another poem, Dauber, D-A-U-B-E-R, Dauber, contains autobiographical elements. It is a poem with autobiographical aspects or elements. The daffodil fields, Reynard, R-E-Y-N-A-R-D, Reynard. The Fox and Right Royal. Fox and Right Royal are his famous narrative poems. These are his other famous, well-known narrative poems, which are the famous narrative poems, The Daffodil Fields, Reynard, The Fox, and Right Royal are his famous narrative poems. His later poetry appeared in the Midsummer Night. His later poems or later poetry appeared in Midsummer Night. Collected poems. Then England Beginning and Wandering. His poetry is marked by a strong note of realism. We can of course say that his poetry is marked by a strong note of realism. Masefield beautifully combined romance with realism. He was able to combine very beautifully romance with realism. Sea Fever, a poem. Sea Fever, Cargoes, The Sea Case, and Sea Change. Bring out the romance and adventure of sea life. These poems, which poems? Sea Fever, Cargoes, The Sea Curse, and The Sea Change bring out the romance and adventure of sea life. His love poetry has a note of melancholy and sadness. We can see the touch of melancholy and sadness in his love poems. His love poetry has a note of melancholy and sadness about them. He believed in coffin or grave as the theme of his love poems. He used the coffin or grave as the theme of his love poems. So this is about John Masefield. Then another poet, James Ellery Flecker. James Ellery, E-L-O-R-Y, Flecker, F-L-A-C-K-E-R, Flecker. His period was between 1884 and 1950. See, James Ellery Flecker published the Bridge of Fire. Then 42 poems. The Golden Journey to Samarkand and the Old Ships. These are some of his well-known poems. The Bridge of Fire, 42 poems. The Golden Journey to Samarkand and the Old Ships. He was captivated by, this poet was greatly fascinated or attracted or captivated by the romance of the East, romance of the Eastern countries, and had the unique gift. He had the unparalleled gift or ability of portraying the exotic. Exotic means foreign countries and the remote countries in vivid colors. He had a unique ability, unique capability, or unique gift of portraying or depicting the exotic or the foreign countries and remote areas or countries in vivid, very clear colors. He was the master of apt diction. He used only apt wordings, apt words in his versification or poetry, and jeweled phrases. He was a lover of ornamentation. He used jewel or ornamented phrases. He was a master of apt diction and jeweled phrases. He has full command over his language and versification. And this poet has full command, full mastery, full command over the language he used and versification. Versification means the act of writing poetry. In the act of writing poetry as well as usage of language. He had a great mastery. He had a full command. Then another poet, Ralph Hodgson. Ralph Hodgson. Ralph Hodgson. His period was between 1871 and 1962. 1962. Hodgson's early poetry has emotional force and also subtlety. Hodgson's early poetry, the earlier poems of Hodgson, had emotional force and subtlety. Ralph Hodgson excelled in the art. He outshone in the art of compressing wide range of pictorial and dramatic effects into the minimum of words. Actually, Ralph Hodgson excelled or outshone. He expressed his capability in the art of compressing wide range of pictorial and dramatic effects. Pictorial effects as well as pictorial means related to picture. Pictorial and dramatic effects into minimum of words. That means using minimum words he was able to portray a wide range of pictorial and dramatic scenes. His works include The Bull published in the year 1930. Eve and other poems published in the year 1913. It was also published in the same year. Another poem, Song of Honor. It was also published in the same year, 1913. And poems, collection of poems, 1917. His poetry is characterized by his deep love and intense compassion for animals. We can see in his poetry deep love and compassion for animals. His later poems were published after a long period of silence. He kept mum for a long period. He kept silence for a long period. Only after a long period of silence came his later poems. The Skylark and other poems, 1958. And collected poems published in the year 1961. Then another poet, W. Gibson, Gibson, W. Gibson. His period was between 1878 and 1962. 1878 and 1962. Gibson was a prolific poet whose poems were published in collected poems. The Golden Hum, The Note of Love, Stone Fields, Daily Bread, Fires, Thoroughfares, Likelihood, Home and Neighbors, I Had a Sailor, The Golden Broom and Hazards. You know, Gibson was a prolific poet. He was an able. Prolific means capable, able, gifted poet, whose poems were published in a lot of anthologies. They are collected poems, The Golden Hum, H-E-L-M, Hum, The Note of Love, Stone Fields, Daily Bread, Fires, Thoroughfares means large, wide roads, thoroughfares. Then Borderland Battle, Likelihood, Home and Neighbors, I Had a Sailor. Then Gibson's early poems are mostly imitative and reveal Tennyson's influence. When we examine W. Gibson's early poems, we can see an imitative style of Tennyson, Alfred Lord Tennyson. Gibson's early poems are mostly imitative and reveal Tennyson's influence. He mixes up romance and supernatural in his poems. He mixes up both the supernatural and romantic elements in his novels. In his later poetry, he deals with the sordid, the hard realities of industrial life. His later poems are realistic. They reveal the sordid, very hard, sordid, rough realities of industry having low status. His poems are full of compassion for the underdog. His symbols are actually drawn from the crudest scenes of the life. The symbols that he used in the poems were taken from the crudest scenes, the rough and tough, hard scenes of life of the poor people. He uses the language of common people with a conversational ease and naturalness. Like a conversation, his language in poetry goes. He uses the language of common people, ordinary people. He uses the language used by ordinary poor people in the society with a conversational ease and naturalness. His language has a conversational ease and naturalness about it. Then another poet, John Drinkwater. John Drinkwater. His period is between 1882 and 1937. 1882, 1937. Drinkwater's poetry is conspicuous for classical restraint and discipline. Drinkwater's poetry is conspicuous, means we can clearly see, clearly visible. Conspicuous means clearly visible. In his poems, the classical restraint and discipline. The restraint, the control and discipline which remained in earlier times, earlier period. The control and the discipline which remained in classical period or earlier period is discernible or visible in his poems. Drinkwater's poetry is conspicuous, clearly visible for classical restraint, control and discipline. He was an intellectual poet. Drinkwater was an intellectual poet who took interest in elegiac and meditative poetry. He took interest in sad and thoughtful poetry, elegiac, sad poetry, and meditative poetry, and not in songs and lyrics. He was not interested in songs and lyrics. He published the collected poems, Men and Hour, H-O-U-R, Men and Hour, and poems of love and earth. Drinkwater's nature poetry is memorable. His nature poetry of the nature is highly memorable. Few modern poets equal Drinkwater in appreciating nature. See, very few poets equal Drinkwater. John Drinkwater in the appreciation of nature, means there are so many poets who appreciated nature like John Drinkwater. Then another poet, Harold Munro, M-O-N-R-O, Harold Munro. His period was between 1872 and 1932. 1872 and 1932. Harold Munro's collected poems were published in 1933 with an introduction by T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, the author of Wasteland. See, T.S. Eliot criticized the Georgian poets with the themes of cuckoos, daffodils, and timid hares, H-A-R-E, hares, etc. But Munro's collected poems came out with a preface or an introduction by T.S. Eliot. His poetry is more urban. He wrote about urban life rather than rural life. His poetry is more urban and more realistic than those of other Georgians. His poems are more urban and more realistic than those of other Georgians. His poetry is more urban and more realistic than that of other Georgians. He is chiefly remembered not as a poet, but as a founder of Poetry Review, the magazine Poetry Review, in 1912, and the Poetry Bookshop. He was also the publisher of books. He ran a bookshop. It was a bookshop of poems, poetry books, the Poetry Bookshop, which he opened in London in 1913. He is chiefly remembered not as a poet, but as a founder of Poetry Review in 1912, and later the Poetry Bookshop, which he opened in London in 1913, and ran until his death in 1932. He conducted the bookshop until his death in 1932. Okay, this much about Georgian poets. And from these Georgian poets, we can study about war poets in another video.